Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cass Business School. I'm Julian Anoitzi. I'm the Chief Executive of Pool Re. We appreciate your coming and having such a large turnout on what is a very hot day outside, and of course Paul is worried that you're all going to disappear in a minute to watch the World Cup. Anyway, Pool Re was delighted to sponsor this important piece of research on the protection gap entities and their unique position between the state and markets. Like every one of our panellists here this evening, Pool Re has experienced firsthand the delicate balancing acts at the heart of public gap entities who sit between market and state. And so this is one of the most comprehensive pieces of research and analysis looking at the way many risk pools are operating and the benefits and challenges that the different pools face. And as one of the few of you that was lucky enough to read the copy before this evening, I want to commend Paula and her team for a very insightful and timely piece of work. Timely because, like many of you, I share a view that the level of uninsured risk that nations and global communities face mean that we must be imaginative and forward-thinking about how we manage these risks in the future. And that can only be achieved by bringing together the different perspectives from the business community, and in particular insurance, government and academia, in an open discussion so that we can derive the best possible solutions to these problems. So I'm delighted to see so many of you here from different fields, and in particular I'm pleased that we're being joined not by some of the UK experts, but also a number of international speakers and visitors alike. You're very welcome. We also have representatives from the UK government as well. And so once again, I'd like to thank you, and before I hand over to Paula, many of you will know Paula from her previous work on the global reinsurance industry and her book, Making Markets for Acts of God. She and her team have since been collecting data on how governments and markets around the world can better work together to address the growing threat of catastrophic risk. Risk of natural and man-made disaster is rising at an alarming pace, as you all know, and I believe that the results of this informative study will help fuel debate about how we as a society may best address that. Paula.
Thank you, Julian. So thank you, Julian, for the sponsoring this evening, and also thank you all for coming away from pubs, cold beer and football screens. I appreciate that it's a hard act to follow, but I and my colleagues here have done some interesting research. We've got a great panel, so let's hope we make it worth your while, this sacrifice. I think the thing that we are all very aware of if we live in society is that catastrophic risk is increasing, both frequency and severity, and 2017 was a great call to arms on that, with hurricanes, earthquakes, flooding and wildfire around the world. The economic loss of just natural catastrophe in 2017 was some 330 billion. But really that's just a big number. It kind of doesn't make any sense. But if we think about it in terms of some of the economies that were damaged by this, so for example after hurricanes Harvey, Irma and Maria, we see that something like Dominica lost 224% of its GDP. Or in Antigua and Barbuda, we have 95% of housing stock damaged. You can all imagine walking out in your own suburb and in the morning and 95% of the housing stock is damaged. And so I think that's the thing that we're trying to think about this evening, that these are big numbers, but these big numbers mean things to people in communities. And of course we need to be aware that it's not just natural catastrophe. We have catastrophic risk increasing in areas such as terrorism, threat of cyber attack, growing pandemic, and so we're in a situation in which risk is increasing, and the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we protected financially? And thanks to this lovely graph by the Swiss Re Institute, we see that in fact while risk itself is growing apace, insurance or the insured amount of loss is not matching the growth in the economic loss. In other words, the protection gap is growing. And so we have, if we think about that, then we have to say, so if insurance isn't paying because we didn't insure it, then who is paying? And so for those of us in wealthy economies, we can say, oh, well, the government, it's the insurer of last resort. But what is the government? That's just you and me, isn't it? It's the taxpayers. So actually, if we put money into that, then it's something else we can't put money into. And we could say, but what about fragile economies? Well, then that's aid that's got to pay for that. And surely that's a fragile and uncertain form of funding to rely upon when we know that the disasters are increasing. So I think what we have to accept is that it is the victim, ultimately, who is paying, either financially or socially. And that's something that we need to deal with if it's growing in society. So in that sense, we in this study decided to look at, since the protection gap itself is a huge thing, it covers all uninsured risk around the world, it's too big to get a handle on. We decided to look at some things that have already been put in place to try and address this and work out what we could learn from those. And we're looking at what we call protection gap entities. Organisations, some of them decades old, that have been set up specifically to bring market solutions to address local risks and local protection gaps. And that's what the thrust of this study is. And so these are quite interesting organisations. They have basically been brought to transfer or instigated to transfer risk, the risk of an earthquake or a flood in local regions into global capital markets, or indeed onto ring-fenced government balance sheets, so that we know that capital will be there to pay after a disaster. To put in place something like this is actually quite an enterprise. It can take sometimes 10 or more years of negotiations to actually make one of these come about and stick. Because you've got to think about it. We have political will, and we understand that political will and political attention is fairly short term. Straight after disaster, it's interested in doing something, and then the thing moves on. We need to bring in ministries of finance, we need to bring in government budgets, we need to bring in market players who, left to their own devices, might see that whole set of objectives very differently in terms of risk and reward and pricing. And then we've had to bring in other things like aid organisations and citizens, and community activist groups. So when we think about the act of getting something together, it's already a big and complex thing to do. And these are uneasy truces with lots of tensions in them. But the fact that we've already been able to make an organisation means we should study what happens once we have brought in an organisation that can bring global capital to provide for local risk. There are three reasons why governments, and they're always brought about by government legislation at the end, government must make this stick, and there are three main reasons why these come about. And so one is what we call a disruption in supply. So in 1994, after the Northridge earthquake in California, which reportedly cost, the insured loss reportedly cost more than 80 years of premium for earthquake in California, the insurance market understandably got a little nervous about their ability to price and pay for that kind of risk. And given that they had to mandatory offer earthquake insurance on homeowners' policies, they simply withdrew from the market. It wasn't a risk they could confidently cover with their capital. And so the California Earthquake Authority is one PGE formed to address a problem in supply, able to offer that mandatory earthquake, that mandatory offer of earthquake cover. So this is one of the reasons why they might come about, for a disruption in supply, to allow us as homeowners or our businesses to remain protected. Then another reason would be what we might call the threat of unaffordable insurance. As we come to know that some regions are in some properties are in very highly exposed areas, where they regularly get hit by tropical cyclone or tropical storm, where they regularly get hit by a flood, then we have the fear that those premiums go up and up for those policyholders, and therefore it may become unaffordable, and they will fall out of the pool of insureds. That's not good for a society to have some insureds and some uninsureds. It creates a number of inequities about how we pay after the flood or after the cyclone. And so Flood Re is one of those examples, an organisation that came about to levy some in order to be able to pay for those at high risk. And in another situation, we actually have countries where there isn't much insurance penetration. And so there isn't an insurance market to rely upon, and yet there can often be fragile economies very exposed to disaster. And so we have had particular types of PGE come about, such as the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, to provide products that will allow those types of countries to have some capital injection after disaster to deal with the aftermath. So what I guess we're saying is there's a lot of organisations already out there trying to deal with this problem, and some of them doing so with considerable success. We believe there's a lot of learning we can do from those about how to go forward into an area at a time of increasing catastrophic risk. So let me to show you some of the things that these organisations can do. Okay, and so there are really two things that are classic strategies: removing risk or redistributing risk. And I'm going to talk about those. But if we don't do either of those things, then we're not actually doing anything. We're just letting the protection gap grow and not attending to it. We have no response. One of the responses is what we call removing risk. So removing risk is is a situation in which you say, okay, we need the market to be able to provide products. For example, in California, with the earthquake, we need to be able to provide homeowner insurance so that people can get, mortgages and so forth. So if we remove some of that risk into a PGE, or if we remove some of that risk onto a government balance sheet, we know that somebody is there to pay for the losses. So risk removal is a very classic strategy that's very good for disruption in supply. Pool Re is an organisation, the terrorism pool in the UK, that came about because of a disruption in supply. After the terrorist bombings of the Baltic Exchange, a terrorism pool was set up in order to provide terrorism insurance to businesses and to the commercial properties in London, so that London could continue getting investment, because without terrorism insurance, you can't trade. So it's a really great way to deal with disruption in supply, and the risk was removed so the insurers could trade terrorism risk, but the payment for that was removed to the government balance sheet, ring-fenced, to be sure that we would have some capital to pay. So it's a good way to deal with disruption in supply, particularly sudden contraction in supply, and it's a good way to deal with highly volatile risk, where it's difficult to price and it's difficult to know when it will come. Because if an insurance market is to take a risk, it needs enough certainty that it's getting the price and the capital that it will be able to pay for the losses. And so this is one of those ways that we can deal with volatile risks that are quite difficult to do that. But any solution brings with it its own downfalls or its own challenges. And this one, of course, because it removes risk from the market, allows the market to trade, possibly without some of the responsibilities of that trading, then it can weaken risk appetite. A market that doesn't trade in risk and have to pay for the risk that it takes will unavoidably become a flooding market, a market that is unable to innovate. And of course, we also worry that it could skew the volatile risk, a sort of adverse selection in which the government gets all the worst risk, that small pool of very difficult to price risk, and allows the market to trade almost subsidised. Now, obviously, that's an extreme case, and that's not what we want to happen, and not necessarily what we see happening. But we need to be aware that any solution that we put in place can indeed have within it the seeds of its problems. So let's talk about another solution that we have. This is redistribution. And redistribution really goes back to the old principles of insurance. So before we could really price risk very accurately or know the severities and the frequencies of things, we could simply say insurance can work on a sort of a mutualisation and a law of large numbers. The premiums of the many will pay for the losses of the few. And so redistribution is really trying to recreate that through a government mechanism, okay, in which we say that we will levy all insureds some small amount so that we can smooth the price for those who are at most risk and who might therefore fall out of the insurance pool. So redistribution is a way of recreating that, and it's actually very attractive when you have a small number of properties that are at high risk, and that it would be beneficial as a society to keep those insured and have some form of capital to pay for their losses. And so it's an excellent system for that, and it recreates the old insurance model. It's also useful if you have a nationalised approach to insurance anyway, because you can to some extent say, well, nationally, we'd all like to be protected, it's better for us all. It does have, of course, within it some weaknesses. Think back to what I was saying about the increases in the severity and frequency of catastrophic risk. With climate change and with growing urbanisation in highly exposed areas, it's no longer the premiums of the many paying for the losses of the few. What if it's the losses of the many with their high value assets in these highly exposed areas? Then we have to call into question, can redistribution really work anymore? And also, does redistribution, keep in mind that when market prices highly, market is sending a signal. This is risky. This is not a good place to build. This is not a good way to build. And so we have to think that when we move that, so on the one hand, we do something useful. On the other hand, the flip side of that is we may destroy the signals that tell us we need to do risk mitigation here rather than continuing on our merry way. And so those sorts of solutions, I think, we need to think they come about in the origins of any PGE, but ultimately what we'd want to see is some combination of the different approaches as they go through a trajectory, and some sharing of risk between government, between PGEs, and between markets, appropriately apportioned to where we can get the best play. And of course, above and beyond this, we need to talk about some of the things. So far, we've only been talking about insured, risk that was already insured. Okay, so high penetration markets. And we tend to think about policyholders, we tend to think about commercial businesses. But we need to remember that sovereigns need protection too. If you think about sovereign states, in some ways they own the most of the assets, okay? The schools, the hospitals, the roads, the rails, the airports, a lot of these are actually part of state infrastructure. And when we have disasters, they too go under. And so there have actually been some very interesting innovations. I think this is one of the most interesting and innovative areas in the insurance industry, and we've been studying it for a while. Innovation and insurance are starting to come together, but they weren't necessarily a word you'd put together in the past. And I think that what's quite important is to think that here what we have is perhaps developing economies relatively fragile, and we have developed a set of products for countries that don't have a lot of data, and where we don't know the vulnerability to loss and the replacement. And yet we've been able to provide products, and these products are what we call disaster liquidity products, that will trigger to provide a small injection of capital immediately after a disaster to allow that country to respond to the aftermath of disaster. So it's an insurance product, but it operates in a different way to perhaps those of you who are familiar with reconstruction. And I put up the example of Mauritania advisedly because it's at the African risk capacity, which is one of these PGEs that's been set up to, over time, hopefully provide many African governments with some form of risk protection. Mauritania took out a drought product for some $1.5 million, just under that. And that drought product, or an agriculture product, which did indeed trigger and gave them a payout of nearly $6.5 million. With that, they were able to provide 50,000 households with food for 4 months. And in doing so, they were able to mitigate a much worse disaster. A disaster in which people who couldn't get food security would begin to migrate and so forth. And so we can see that these products are really quite exciting. I mean, that's a very big leveraging of within one single year to support food security. So the thing that's a great promise about these products is that they're rapid. Okay, the payment happens if the triggers are met, if the cyclone hits in a particular area at a particular wind speed, or the earthquake is a particular magnitude and a particular conurbation, then the payout can be, and as CRIF showed in 2017, the payouts can be within 2 weeks. That's money that you can rely on, and some statistics seem to show that money at the right point in time, a small amount at the right point in time, prevents exacerbated loss further down the track. And so it is that these rapid payments right away can do things like paying for petrol for generators, food security, keep your civil service working so that they can support your aid systems, and these are very valuable things. In addition, and I think this is very important, they give empowerment and autonomy to sovereigns who don't have to wait for the aid community to come in the way that it wants to come, giving the kinds of things that it thinks are useful. A sovereign can connect to its people and support them immediately. So these are great things, but they do come at a challenge. Although we're only talking about not even $1.5 million, that's a lot of money on a strained budget in which there are so many competing resources in very fragile economies. So although the leveraging is fabulous, still the cost of provision can be high, relatively. And I think we also need to keep in mind what I said at the start. Think about Dominica, 224% of GDP. Think about Antigua and Barbuda, 95% of housing stock. Even if you get this payout, it's not a payout that's going to help you to reconstruct. It's a payout to do one particular type of thing. And I think that we need to think about what are the right sorts of products to help with the next stage of resilience to these kinds of disasters. So what I've talked about so far is what PGEs have done. And largely, they have been very successful. Were you a New Zealand citizen, as indeed one of my team is, and you had suffered the earthquakes in Christchurch, it must be some comfort to know that you'll get a small amount of money. You and everyone in your community will get a small amount of money, enough to start the rebuilding. And so I think that these things we can show that they have worked. But I think we also need to be aware that their job and what they do is to bridge local protection gaps. Earthquake in New Zealand, earthquake in California, tropical cyclone somewhere, flood somewhere else. They're actually, so they are there to provide a financial solution to that. And I think we don't sweat this asset enough. To speak as a strategy professor, we've gone to all the trouble of forcing governments and markets to find a solution to something, and then we hold them too tightly and don't let them do as much as they could do. Because what might they do? Well, for a start, they have to bring the key stakeholders to the table every 3 years usually, because of their legislative requirements, or every 5 years. And so they can frame the dialogue. The risk is growing, it's not going away. We have something there that allows us to at least bring the right parties together to talk about that. In addition, they do develop expertise for us. So if we think about somewhere like the Pacific, okay, Pacific Islands, so they may have had some risk sorts of modelling to understand, but until they were going to develop a financial solution that needed a price to be traded into a capital market, then you start to do serious risk modelling. You bring in the climate scientists, the meteorologists, you understand what your probabilities of risk are and what the possible losses might be. And regardless of whether you actually choose to buy a financial product, you can then use that information to prepare for risk, to make decisions about how much you can actually take. And so that expertise that they bring could allow us to reduce the protection gap, not just to bridge it financially, but to reduce it by taking on risk mitigation and other types of resilience measures. And I think we could make more of this, although I'll talk about some of the challenges. But I think what we need to understand is that some of these things came about literally decades ago. If we think about the Spanish pool, for example, and yet they now have global effects. The protection gap is a global discourse, largely due to the work of some of our key reinsurers and some of our key policy bodies. It's a global discourse and we know it's a problem. We have a lot of local solutions. How can we join them together to better understand what they can do? And as part of that, I think we need to keep in mind that we've set up some things to deal with local protection gaps in ways that are largely a stopgap. Okay, so we've given them a very limited remit at their moment of origin, and the question is, do we let them go further? Because they were not set up to, say you were set up in 1993, pool re, okay? We had not had 9/11 at that stage. We had not had lone terrorists. The gap itself evolves. Do we let our pools evolve? And we can say that about any form of risk, not just terrorism, volatile though that is. And so I think we also have to be aware, though, that their remit is quite constrained. They are there to provide a financial solution, a market solution to a social problem. If the social problem is growing, perhaps we could be looking at how they could also have a wider influence in joining the pieces. And I think one of the things that always, it startles me. We have the California Earthquake Authority, and we know that California is exposed to earthquake. If there's nothing else you know, you saw that crappy movie about it. Yeah? And so, and yet, we have only 11% penetration of domestic or homeowner earthquake insurance. So somehow, these things are constrained. They're not able to have the effect they could. Do you know that some of these pools actually can help you to do more resilient reconstruction? In California, you can get a package. You can rebuild your house in ways that will make it more resilient to earthquake. And you can get that from the California Earthquake Authority. But how can we make people take it up? In this country, if you have a flood, you can get a package to help you build back in a more resilient way. But it's not necessarily joined to the very PGE that could support you in maybe making those joined up steps. So I think we need to think about the stopgap sometimes doesn't let us have the influence or do the framing we need to do of the problems. And finally, I think we need to be very aware that they're set up by a group of stakeholders at a moment in time who just want the problem to go away. Okay, we had a disruption in supply, just fix the problem. Or we've got a problem where people aren't getting insured, just fix the problem. And then those stakeholders, their attention goes elsewhere. But later on, somewhere you have a big flood, and it turns out that that wasn't what you were protected for because you never set up a pool to do it. And you look and you go, why aren't we protected? We have a flood pool. Okay, and so we need to think that stakeholder expectations will evolve, the gap will evolve, we know those things will evolve. Do we let the PGEs evolve? And with that in mind, I'm actually going to ask 3 panels up now, enough from me, okay? I'm actually going to ask 3 different panels of industry experts. You know, I'm just talking about it, I'm the academic, but these people are at the sharp end, they're actually trying to deal with it, so let's get some answers from them. And one of the questions I think we need to say is, we know that these disaster liquidity products have been great in providing a different way of thinking about insurance and bringing it to economies that maybe are quite fragile for a whole host of reasons and also very exposed. But is it enough? Can we do more? The second question I think we do have to address is, if we really want to solve the protection gap, then actually we could just make cover mandatory. And of course, there are many reasons why we might not choose to do that, particularly in free market economies. It's a question we need to ask, because some pools and some kinds of mechanisms have been set up from the start to be mandatory or have an aged history of that, where in others we choose voluntary, but in choosing voluntary, do we also choose underinsurance? And indeed, to allow people not to take ownership of their own risk. And finally, of course, when I talked in my last statement about that we need to let these things evolve, evolving Remit is of course very important, but we also want to be careful that we don't have mission creep, organisations that don't know what they're doing or that become bloated. What's the delicate balance between those things? So without further ado, I'd actually like to invite our first panel onto the stage to have a talk to us about the first theme.
A warm welcome from my side. I am Constantino Chalkes. I am a member of the research team that conducted this study. And it's our privilege to have 3 very knowledgeable people here with us today to discuss about this first panel. Next to me, I have Isaac Anthony, who is the CEO of CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, which is actually the first multi-country risk pool in the world. Next to him, we have Tania Serrano-Chavez, who is a risk analysis director in the Ministry of Finance in Mexico. And she is responsible for the renewal process of fondants reinsurance programs. She also gives advices to states about the risk management strategy that they follow, and also she is involved in monitoring fondant damage adjustment process. And finally, we have also Dr. Nicola Ranger, who is a senior advisor at DFID, and also currently she is the acting director of the London Center for Global Disaster Protection. So I'm going to give the floor to you, and let's start with Isaac.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. So in terms of CRIF, when the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility was set up in the year 2007, it was really designed to provide immediate liquidity to the governments of the Caribbean for earthquake, tropical cyclone, and excess rainfall. The quick liquidity that it provides does, in a sense, represent the sort of value proposition for those countries in terms of helping them to recover quickly. And as the report cited, in a sense, $1 of disaster relief received almost immediately following an event has far more utility than the resources that will be provided 6 or 7 months later. So CRIF was really never designed to cover all of the losses, and I think that is a point that really needs to be emphasized. In fact, again, the report does actually cite, I think, one of the beneficiary governments from last year who described the payout received as a drop in the bucket. The only way I'll differ from that is to say it was a very big drop, because it did actually help the country in terms of the immediate recovery. But there are 2 aspects to the whole question of the whole aspect of disaster recovery, and more specifically filling the protection gap that I really want to address. The first one has to do with the question of complementarity. And by that I mean the insurance coverage that CRIF provides is really intended to complement other disaster risk financing mechanisms, such as disaster funds that typically governments try to set up, contingent credits, which is something that is now emerging, and it seems to be available from the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IDB. And also we have, obviously, ODA and other sources of grant resources, and of course, loans. And again, it's no secret that many of the Caribbean countries are highly indebted. And one of the main reasons for that is because they've had to borrow heavily to be able to recover from those disasters. So complementarity is a very important part. There's the other aspect of the protection gap, which has to do with underinsurance, which, as you know, is a huge issue. So even with all the strides that we've made more recently in terms of providing coverage, some of the countries are not where they ought to be in terms of insurance. They are really underinsured. And this is one of the things that we are actually working on right now. It was actually good to see that following last year's events in terms of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, that countries have actually bought more coverage this year. So that is one aspect. There's the other aspect that has to do with the introduction of new coverage or new products. So because now CRIF is now seen as being very successful in terms of what it is doing, there's a lot of interest in terms of additional products. So one of the things that we have done, in addition to earthquake, tropical cyclone, and excess rainfall, we have now introduced a drought product. It's really a model, and with the product is going to be made available for the next season. We're also now looking at sector-specific insurance. For example, agriculture. Agriculture continues to be one of the biggest economic mainstay in the Caribbean, and CRIF is actually working to develop an agricultural product. We're also looking, in fact, we have actually started working on a product which is really designed for the fishery sector, for the fisher folk. We're also looking to do, potentially working with the private sector to help address the protection gap in the housing sector, because we know that people's homes, houses are one of the sectors that's hardest hit because of a natural disaster. And also we are looking, in fact we have been approached, interestingly, by the hotel sector, because you know, I think a lot of you probably would have visited the Caribbean, and you know that a lot of the hotels are actually on the beaches, right? And very vulnerable to storm surge and strong winds and so on. And so there's a lot of interest certainly in CRIF potentially providing some product. And also there is the possibility that we can actually look a bit deeper to provide insurance for specific government assets. For example, and again, Paula did allude to the question of insurance for the health sector, for the education sector. So these are some of the things that we are looking. But there are two aspects that I need to point out as we try to scale up insurance coverage in the region. One has to do with the question of affordability. How far can governments go in being able to allocate more resources out of the national budget in order to be able to buy insurance? So that's one of the big issues. Already it is a challenge now, let alone introducing new products. Where are those resources going to come from? And the second aspect has to do with not just the affordability aspect, but in terms of the availability of grant resources to support scaling up. And of course, we will continue to work with our donors in that regard. And more specifically, resources from the capital markets, for the reinsurance market, to support risk transfer. So these are going to be some very big issues. So I just want to emphasize that while liquidity clearly is not enough, but what we are now doing in terms of providing more coverage for the countries is certainly helping to make a difference.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, in Mexico, what we're doing, I'm gonna talk and give you a brief context of Fonden. We have pursued over 20 years a strategy in order to manage the catastrophic risk. We call this strategy that it's composed by layers. The first layer is Fonden. As you may know, Fonden is a trust or a fund composed by budgetary bad budget, and it's a retention vehicle that we conformed to attend the emergency and the reconstruction actions after a natural disaster. Fonden protects for 18 risks, including earthquakes, hurricanes, heavy rains, flooding, and another more or less 10 risks. And it has rules, public rules, that define how the federal agencies, as the local governments, have to, all the actions and that they have to done to access to the resources. The second layer of this strategy, it's conformed by the an excess loss in insurance, that is a traditional instrument of insurance. It gives us a protection about $260 million. And the third instrument is the catastrophic bond. The catastrophic insurance gives us protection for the same risk that contemplates the Fonden, and the catastrophic bond only for earthquakes and hurricanes, because we have identified that these are the two risks more that can impact more to the country. In terms of federal strategy, we have considered that this strategy have working on, but we have identified, of course, some challenges in terms of this. In terms of the layers that I have told, we have an additional layer that we called as the cross layer. That is, it is composed by the federal agencies' insurance and the local government's insurance programs. These programs isn't mandatory, but we try to encourage by the rules of Fonden to these local governments and agencies to have this insurance program. As you may know, Fonden gives to the federal infrastructure support of 100% of the damages, and for the local governments, they only have access to the 50%. After the earthquakes of September of the last year, we identified that this percent for the local governments wasn't enough to attend the emergency. Just to give you an example, in Oaxaca, we have a lot of damages on the housing sector, so we have to change the rules of Fonden to allow us to give a more percent for attending the emergency. Oaxaca had a program, an insurance program, but it wasn't enough to attend the emergency. So we have, as a federal government, to give more resources by Fonden to attend all the damages that was principally on the housing sector. So what are we doing in terms of reducing the gap for these challenges in terms of local governments? In the Fonden's rules, we have defined a risk management strategy that it is defined by the local governments. It is composed by 3 steps. The first one is that the local governments has to identify what are the assets that they need to protect. This stock needs to be aligned with the Fonden's rules, with the risk and these assets that Fonden's has to protect. The second step is the risk analysis of this and that the state has to face, and it has to be aligned with the Fonden's rules. And the third step is that they have to design a transferring risk instrument for protection this infrastructure. This is in order to increase the resources available to attending the emergency and to attending the reconstruction actions that the local governments has to face. Another action, we have the last year we have an instrument called the pool of states, that it was a program, an insurance program for all the states that have developed this risk management strategy. So it is another action in these terms to reduce the gap in terms of states governments.
Thank you. So I work for the UK government for Department for International Development. So why does the Department for International Development care about insurance, I guess, is an important question. So we come at it from not from the angle of trying to close the insurance gap. That's not what's important for us. What's important for us is that governments have the finances in place and understand their risks and own their risks, to allow them to respond more quickly when disasters happen. So we've been supporting work in this area for about 10 years as a donor organisation. CRIF was one of our first investments, which was actually a very small investment. And really, as Isaac said, at that time, it was very much about closing this liquidity gap. So we saw that when disasters happened, in fiscally constrained economies that are, in some cases are highly indebted, that governments really ground to a halt when disasters happened, and that can mean a delayed response, people not being able to get back to their jobs, houses not being able to be rebuilt, and that can massively increase the costs of disasters to that economy. So that's why at that time, back in 2006, 2007, DFID invested in that capital into that risk pool. But I think things have changed a lot since those days, so sort of more than 10 years later, where we are. And actually a lot of the learning has actually come from Fondon and why we've changed our approach in this space. So I guess firstly coming back to sort of what, is it about insurance or something else? So what we do now, particularly as part of the Centre for Global Disaster Protection, which is a new initiative, is we provide technical assistance to governments to help them understand their risks, but then also on their balance sheet, what are their contingent liabilities in a disaster situation, and what finances do they have in place to manage that? And some of that might be best managed through insurance, some of it might be best managed through other types of instruments, be it your own disaster fund or a contingent credit or something else. And what the centre does is provides a sort of neutral technical assistance to governments to help them assess what's the right mix of instruments for them to get the best sort of value for money solutions. And that will usually have insurance as a part of it. But what we've actually learned sort of from those early days, and particularly inspired by Fondon, is that coming back to this question, is liquidity enough? Well, liquidity is a start, but actually insurance and pre-arranged finance can do a lot more than that. And what we learned from Fondon is actually from looking at the impact that has had. It's really been through not just the insurance part, but actually the data, the understanding of risk, the pre-event planning and preparedness. And that means that when an event happens in Mexico, you can respond incredibly quickly and you know exactly where the money's going. So we as DFID, and I think in the donor community, really sort of learnt from that experience and said, well, how can we take that learning to other countries as well and help them look at how they can use finance to drive resilience more broadly. And that's really our focus now in DFID, and that's really this sort of a shift towards, this question of is liquidity enough? Actually, it can do a lot more. What we realised, particularly in the last couple of years, is that the whole way that the donor and the multilateral community funds disasters is actually part of the problem. Humanitarian aid is a wonderful thing, it saves lives, but the whole international system is set up to only act after a disaster happens. You have to wait till a disaster happens, you wait and you see it appear on the news, and then the money floods in, you go to the World Bank, you get your crisis response window payment. Everything is after a disaster, and that's completely the wrong way of doing it. It has to be before, which is exactly what Fondon does. And if you don't mind me talking about yours, is that everything is done before. The data's in place, the plans are in place, the finance is in place, and that's really the approach that we're taking now. To give an example of some of the things that we're working on, Africa risk capacity was mentioned, so the key innovation there was it's not just the finance, but it has preparedness planning as part of it. So finance is triggered, but we know exactly where that money is going to go when a disaster happens. And just the process of that planning actually builds the capacity of government and helps them to be more resilient. And then where we're taking it from now and sort of the forward-looking part is looking at particularly the sort of recovery gap. So we saw in the Caribbean after the hurricanes, very rapidly things happened, but then things slowed down when it got to the recovery phase. And it wasn't because of a lack of finance. The money was flowing in. It was really the pre-planning of the government and the capacity of the governments were not there. So we're now looking at, can we use finance in some way to incentivize that building capacity to respond more quickly in the recovery phase, and then also towards the reconstruction phase as well. And part of what we're doing in the centre is looking at, can you design new innovative financial instruments that are linked with planning and preparedness and capacity building activities to actually drive that greater resilience.
Thank you very much. I think we had some very nice insights from a multi-country risk pool that provides disaster liquidity products. We had insights from a single country pool that does also reconstruction, and also we had the views from the donors country, and how they work with developing economies. And so we would like to welcome a few questions. We have like a few minutes for a couple of questions.
Raveen Ismail, Fractal Industries. Just a question maybe to begin with for Dr. Ranger. Just like it's been touched upon, that the timing at which funds are made available after a disaster matters, and that the cost can go up after a few months or as time passes. If one goes backwards though, if prevention is better than cure, then making funds available before a disaster happens or when an impending disaster is about to happen can also be very useful indeed. I think that DFID themselves have worked out some ratios, whether it's I think 3-to-1 or 8-to-1 as regards every pound that goes in for prevention. From the insurance market perspective though, once a disaster happens, the trigger for that, whether it's an ILW, industry loss warranty or catastrophe bonds, the payout can then happen. The triggers for prevention, or the metrics that need to go into that, are much more difficult. So I'm curious as to whether there's any work being done in this area, because it could be, we could get that much more bang for our buck.
Well, thank you for the question. It's a great question, and that's one of the things we're thinking a lot about. And there's some interesting innovations in this area, and particularly about sort of having double triggers, of which maybe just the latter one is insurance. So, for example, having a trigger based on a forecast or some sort of predictive analytics before the event happens that would fund preparedness activities, pre-positioning of aid, etc. But then having a second trigger, which might be the actual insurance product that triggers when the event actually happens.
I mean, the softer aspect of that, how would you get governments and the market to trust what is the pre-disaster trigger, or because none of us trust each other's opinion, right? So we're all the best in doing that ourselves. So
in the examples that I've seen so far, the first trigger hasn't been insurance. The first trigger has been some sort of contingent finance that's sat in a fund somewhere. So that funds that, but then the insurance comes in at the second trigger when you do. It's a hard trigger.
No, sorry. When you asked the question, I was wondering whether you were touching on the question of mitigation generally, because I know that is always been one of the concerns, in that if you invest more in disaster mitigation, then there'll be less of a need for insurance. And that may be so, but no matter how much more you actually invest in mitigation, in insurance there's always the residual risk. And it is that is the risk that we would typically try to cover as best as possible. So we're still strong advocates for countries doing what is necessary to build resilience through adaptation measures and mitigation and so on, but there will always be the element of residual risk.
I actually have one, if anybody wants to do one. So we're actually discussing about disaster liquidity products and traditional insurance products for reconstruction, right? And I was thinking if these two products actually sit alongside, or do you see the disaster liquidity products as a step in order to get to be able to evolve to more traditional insurance reconstruction products?
Well, I can give you like the experience in Mexico in these terms. We have designed this strategy based on two kind of products. The first is the insurance, the traditional insurance. And what is the advantage of this product? It's that all the information that the assessment of damages can give us. As have been said, it gives us all the expertise or the learning to know more about the risk that had been impacted to the country. And the other instrument that is a catastrophic bond, it's another kind of instrument, but that the principal advantage that we can see in this product, it's that we can get quickly the indemnity or the payments for the fund. These both instruments, all the payments has to be done to the trust, to the fund. So this can give you accountability and transparency for the using of the resources. But these are the advantages that we have this trade-off between the quickly recuperation of these payments, and on the other side, maybe the assessment losses and damages for the indemnity insurance can take about 2 or 3 years, but it gives us a lot of information about the risk and the impact of the disasters.
Yeah, so yeah, very good question. In fact, I will say that the CRIF, we specialize in parametric insurance, which is clearly not indemnity insurance, where you do a post-disaster assessment to determine what the losses are. On the basis of the losses, then you actually make a payout. And I know that there's been such suggestion that we move into this traditional insurance domain. But for the time being, we would like to remain parametric. But having said that, there are two possibilities, because the whole question of reconstruction is a very important aspect, I guess, of what we should be trying to promote. One, there is a suggestion that using the existing products, potentially scaling up coverage to make provision for making more resources or releasing more resources to support the long-term reconstruction effort. So that is one possibility. The second possibility, and it is something that David and Nicola specifically we've discussed, is the issue of introducing insurance for specific government assets. Again, we know, for example, in the case of just the whole education sector, I mean, schools are typically affected or destroyed to a certain extent by tropical cyclones or earthquakes and so on, and even the hospitals and the health centers throughout the islands. The question is can we come up with a specific product based on parametric insurance that can actually respond to the needs of those specific sectors? And that is something that we are currently investigating, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to provide a solution.
Thank you very much. I think that's it, and we'll move to the next panel. Sorry, we have to move to the next panel. You can ask a question to the next panel if you want. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Eugenia Cacciatore. I'm also one of the authors of the study, and I am thrilled to have a fantastic panel here to discuss what we really want to solve, whether we want to deal with voluntary or mandatory insurance. We have Esther Bauer here, who's head of the EMEA area for the public sector business of Global Partnership of Swiss Re. We have Dr. Carsten Brussock for SC executive for the northern part of Munich Re, Northern Europe part of the Munich Re, and we have James Vickers, who's chairman of Willis Re. It's a very knowledgeable panel, so without further ado, I will pass the baton to Esther.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. What I like in particular about this panel is that it addresses the demand side of the problem of the protection gap. We have to look very carefully at the reasons why a protection gap exists, what are the causes to find the right solution to it. And we have heard before a lot about these PGEs, I think new term that has been created through this study, addressing shortages, disruptions in supply, or potential fallout of people that have been insured, or serving sovereigns with the risks that end up on their balance sheets. But it's actually even in developed countries, there are many people uninsured and have never had insurance in place. And I think we need to look at why are people not buying and what are the solutions to that problem. And the same problem on the demand side we also observe in the discussion with sovereigns. There's actually quite a lot of supply from the insurance industry to help absorb those risks, but there are not yet enough countries aware of the solutions that are available or equipped to assess and their risks and assess the type of solutions that are available. So I think the question on mandatory or voluntary cover addresses that demand side. I would like to focus a little bit on the developed economies. If you look at different countries, if you look at the empirical evidence, which are the countries that have a very high insurance penetration among homeowners? France, Spain, Switzerland, some of the Nordic countries, the UK also has fairly high penetration. There's always some form of mandatory insurance. It's either included in the normal homeowners policy or it's mandated by law that people have to have insurance. If you look at countries with voluntary natural catastrophe insurance solutions, actually penetration is fairly low. Even in Germany, flood insurance, only about 30% of people have it. In Italy, 2% of homeowners are insured. Paula mentioned California before. So the empirical evidence, if you want to close the protection gap, probably some form of mandatory solution makes sense. But why is that? And what benefit, why should that be desirable? There has been a study by the Bank for International Settlements in 2012 that looked at the economic impacts of natural catastrophes. And it concluded that in countries where penetration is at least 60%, the economic impact is far less than in other economies, and they recover faster than other countries that have very low insurance penetration. And why is that? We can see that there's certainty of the financing. And so reconstruction starts faster. Businesses get back into business faster. But there's also the aspect that insurance has established processes and the discipline of how to organize the payouts, because that is often the problem. Governments are supposed to support the people but don't have the processes in place on how to reach them. So, so there are clear benefits of some form of mandatory insurance. But if you look at a country that looks at how to get there, and especially if they are developing countries, some of the solutions that we have seen in France, Spain, or Switzerland are not available to them because you cannot embed it in existing homeowners policies because there are no existing homeowners policies. So then you have to look into compulsory solutions. But even if you do compulsory solutions by law, you need to ask yourself, can you actually enforce it? For example, Turkey has implemented compulsory earthquake insurance, and there's no mechanism in place to penalize people who are not buying, but on purpose. They want to show the benefit of having insurance. So they go slowly by slowly and have reached in the meantime 50%. But I mentioned before this sort of what we call semi-mandatory solution of embedding it in homeowners policy is not really a viable solution in Italy because also there only about 20% have homeowners insurance policy. So then that's more a question on for legal mandatory systems. I hope my colleagues speak more about the disadvantages of the compulsory solutions. I mean, clearly what we hear most often is that it is being considered a tax. And they're politically difficult to implement. It requires the political will to do it, and that in a democracy requires all stakeholders to agree to it. So maybe I can come back to a few more points afterwards.
Thank you, Esther. Well, coming from Germany, I have to say this. Congratulations to the stellar performance of your football team in Russia. Sorry, I had to get this off my chest. Yeah, we're trying hard. Let's see, tomorrow will be very critical. Anyway, thanks for inviting me to this panel. Voluntary insurance versus mandatory insurance. Our stance here is, and so I take your lead, Esther, actually we as Munich, we prefer private market solutions, period. That said, there are situations where you cannot establish a private market in a timely manner, or where there is a public interest, as Paula alluded to earlier. And then in those situations, we as Munich Re did and will in the future consider compulsory elements. Now, let me go one level deeper into the pros and cons of voluntary private market solutions versus compulsory solutions. There are three key arguments for private market solutions, of course. Firstly, it's a lack of intervention of the government in contract freedom. And this is a very high principle which presents a certain hurdle. But there are a couple of other arguments. Firstly, we have seen that the intervention of government may lead to prices which are not risk adequate. You may think of the Jordan motor market, where prices are so low that they can't cover the costs at all, or the prices are not differentiating enough so that some lesser risks actually drive up the premium of the whole collective. And there's a third argument, a potential moral hazard, which might actually impact the mitigation behavior. This can be argued very honestly, and we have the Swiss Kantonale Gebäudeversicherung, where all the profits of the pool are actually reinvested in prevention. Now, on the flip side, there are some arguments to be made for compulsory insurance in specific situations. And there's no question that compulsory insurance, coming back to what Esther said, has the potential to close the gap. Academically speaking, there is a reason if the sum of the individual's preparedness to pay is smaller than the collective preparedness to pay, where there is a reason for compulsory insurance. And there are two scenarios. First is to protect individuals. This is predominantly on the casualty side the case. You may think of motor liability, you may think of workers' compensation, you may even subsume the motor terror discussion currently in the UK they're under. In many countries, you will find these compulsory elements in these lines of business. The other scenario, of course, is to protect a general public from accumulations, as we have seen in the presentation of Paul at the very beginning. This might be terror, this might be a flood or alike. In those situations, the collaboration between the government and the private sector can build mature risk management systems, and the private sector can actually provide data, actuarial capabilities, claims expertise or alike, and create quite some value here. There's a last pro for compulsory insurance which I'd like to outline, and this is going back to what Nicola said earlier, and there's a very strong belief of Munich Re actually, that it may help to drive a shift from ex post financing to ex ante financing. Most countries are focusing on ex post financing. And this is proven by research the most ineffective and costly way to handle disasters. By the way, the huge insurance gap is driven by the fact that a large part of populations don't buy available products because they are relying on the government ex post. Take Germany, 32%. 99% could have a product available in Germany for flood. 32 take it, because the minister says, look, if it's still raining, I'll finance it, no worries. And very honestly, and now I'm trying to be very diplomatic, government's preparedness to pay may also depend on media presence or governmental circumstances, very honestly. I certainly have seen upcoming elections, let me put it diplomatically, impacting the preparedness to pay more. So summing up, we prefer private market solutions. However, in specific instances where private market solutions cannot build timely or where there's a public interest, we will support compulsory insurance elements. However, this is subject to risk-adequate pricing and significant involvement of the insurance industry to define terms and conditions to avoid any moral hazards. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity for speaking today. I'm going to base my comments on the experience that I and Willis as an organization has had over the last 20 years trying to help this newly coined group, PGEs, get started and get off the ground. And there are a couple of sort of overarching comments before we get into the pros and cons I'd like to just touch on. The first one is distribution. It's all very well talking about having insurance products, but when we talk about voluntary and compulsory, we are not talking about governments, we're talking about individual policyholders. And we've heard, even in developed markets, how the take-up rate is so low. How on earth do you distribute the product in a sensible way? And the other thing is operational costs. These tend to be long-term schemes. The whole idea is to provide funds and relief when the event happens, not to waste the money on operational costs. I mean, obviously for mandatory cover, it's been touched on, universal coverage, the lack of anti-selection. Theoretically, it's a much better risk-sharing mechanism, cross-subsidization of poor risks from better risks to take place. And all of that would argue that you end up with a more sustainable scheme. For governments who might wish to support such schemes, a compulsory scheme can also give a clearer link between their own fiscal issues post-event and what they think can be funded out of the insurance scheme. Funny enough, for the local insurance market, if the scheme works properly, and the insurance market, as Carsten said, is involved in shaping and supporting the scheme, it can be a fantastic tool. I'll give you an example. The Romanian catastrophe pool paid was set up, and the policies on that are sold by the insurance industry. Theoretically, it's a mandatory cover. The limit is very small, but it gives the insurance companies the obligation and the right to go and sell these policies to the Romanian uninsured masses. And once they've made contact with them, the policy limit actually on the paid cat cover is very small. They have the opportunity to sell them maybe a top-up cover or maybe some other completely unrelated insurance product. So for the insurance industry, some of these schemes can work very well. And then, of course, a mandatory scheme, governments can be more comfortable and they can use it as a social subsidy. If you look at the Japan earthquake scheme that was set up in 1966, although it is an indemnity scheme, it's administered by the Japanese insurance industry, it is regarded as a degree of social subsidy because the policy limit is very, very simple. But the problem is with mandatory, and Esther touched on it and Carsten did, it can be seen as a tax. I remember a number of years ago we were involved in looking at a scheme in Iran which brilliantly solved the distribution problem because they were looking at actually collecting the insurance premium as a small add-on on the electricity bill. So dead easy to collect. Disaster from a risk mitigation and risk management point of view because of course you had absolutely no idea what sort of risk was on the other end of the electricity bill. Anyway, that didn't work. The other problem is that mandatory cover doesn't promote risk awareness. People have spoken about this. The risk steering and risk mitigation aspect of insurance, risk-based pricing goes away. And people have a false sense of false security, and it can limit any further penetration of insurance products. The other problem we've seen is, and again, Esther touched on it, is how do you actually enforce a mandatory cover? Turkish catastrophe pool was put in place in 2000. That's 18 years ago, and it's got a 50% penetration. The Algerian catastrophe scheme, ASIP, was put in about 15 years ago, That's supposed to be compulsory, but the compulsory element is you only have to show the insurance policy when you change the ownership deeds on your property. Now in Algeria there's an incredibly low turnover of property sales, and if you do sell your property, the fine you pay for not having paid 10 years premium is practically peanuts. So what a surprise, the take-up rate is terribly low. The other problem with all of these mandatory schemes is they tend to be government-backed to some extent or other, and you get this very difficult problem of separation of the funds between the scheme and the government, and there are innumerable examples of schemes that started off and actually the government has decided to raid the piggy bank because they needed the money at the time. Sri Lankan Riot Terrorism Fund, Hawaiian Hurricane Relief Fund are just two examples. And I think that the final point I would make about mandatory schemes is the expectation around loss settlement. If you've bought an insurance policy, you might be prepared to forgive your insurance company, give them a little bit of leeway in terms of the time that it takes to settle. If you're on a mandatory cover and you are the people administering that, you are going to have the politicians breathing down your neck. Why have you not paid these claims, which in some cases may run into millions? Why haven't you paid them in 2 or 3 weeks? I can remember having a discussion with the people who were putting together the paid scheme, and the question on the table was, for years you will have virtually no claims at all. You might have 10,000 a year. Something will go wrong and you will have to pay 1.5, 2 million policyholders in a very short space of time when the banking system has probably collapsed. How on earth are you going to do that? And the politicians will skin you alive if you can't actually deliver in that circumstance.
On this sobering thought, thank you very much to the panelists for a number of interesting remarks and important remarks. We have had a discussion of the demand side and the implications of the low penetration and how governments can and the private market can collaborate in closing it. We have had a lot of discussion about pros and cons of government intervening in the market and providing insurance in a mandatory way, the private market doing it. And I'm checking out my notes. There is a lot of interesting remarks again in terms of implications for mitigation as well. So with this fantastic background, I wonder whether there is any question.
All three of you mentioned one of the hazards of mandatory schemes was that it would disincentivize mitigation measures. I can see the theoretical argument for that. Is there any evidence in those countries where there is low penetration, like Italy and Germany, that there is massive uptake of mitigation compared to those where they're mandatory? If that's not too leading a question.
I like the question, and I try to put it as a pro for private market solutions, but there is actually no clear evidence that this is the case. And I actually was referring to the Kantonale Beuteversicherer pool, which is a compulsory element, and it manages extremely well, actually, collecting the profits and investing it in prevention. So research doesn't show a very clear answer to that, from what I have read. Perhaps there are other perspectives.
Hi, Gilles Stassen from Swiss Re. So, first of all, it amused me that the broker on the panel emphasized the topic of distribution so much. But on that topic, and in the space of kind of voluntary covers, it seems to me like a big issue is the awareness of risk. So especially when you're talking about nat cat risk, most policyholders are blissfully unaware of what could go wrong, and if something does go wrong, perhaps they experience it, a handful of times in their lifetime. So I'd be curious to hear what what your thoughts are in terms of how you can improve risk awareness and drive demand in that sense.
It's quite interesting. I mean, I don't know if you've read some of the work that Professor Conrother has put out about the psychology of risk awareness. I mean, why did everybody live in California and in Tokyo? And, people who visit are nervous about earthquakes. The people who live there, completely relaxed. And I think there is this sort of suspension of disbelief that, we all have as human beings. We may be living in a dangerous place, but if we worried about it, we'd go mad. And I think it's extremely difficult to change that mindset. Things that seem completely obvious to us on the outside. I don't know the answer because, goodness me, you can go to somewhere like Japan, they have earthquake drills every 2 minutes. Every office you go to, there's a hard hat under the table. They could not be more prepared if you tried, yet still the penetration of insurance is not that high. And I don't know. It's a sort of psychological conundrum, which maybe more intelligent people can work out.
I think this is a huge part to it, but I'm coming back to, if this happens, we have other problems and the government will jump in. And I always take, and we talked about this before, I have seen this, that it was, I said it earlier, it was still raining. And the politics jumped out and said, look, we take care of it. So what's the clear incentive if you think there is a backstop anyway? So I think, and it's coming back to, rather ex ante risk management systems rather than relying, because as long as you assume there's someone who will pick up the bill, you are probably reluctant, specifically if the premium is not small in flood-prone areas or whatnot. But Esther, you probably have thoughts on that.
I don't have much to add on your specific question on how to raise awareness, but one example I'd like to bring is going back to the Turkish model. It is compulsory by law, but as I said before, there's no, you have to show it also when you sell land, but you also have to show it when you apply for gas, water, or electricity, but only, you apply for that once and not every year. It's not linked to the bill. But they have made a conscious decision not to introduce a fine, but actually raise awareness. And if you see the campaigns they have been running, it's quite impressive. So running with trains and buses through the country with earthquake simulators to raise the awareness of the people, to show to them that there's actually a value to it, and it's not just trying to raise the awareness that it's not just a tax.
You showed earlier a slide from Swiss Re which shows the insurance gap is about 100 billion, which is roughly the size of the online gambling market. Yeah? So we're more likely to take on the risk which we don't have in the first place to mitigate this. So I wonder, perhaps we need to think about ourselves a bit. And there's a hurricane season, earthquake days every day. You could bet every day on earthquakes. So we've got 100 billion, but it just goes into the gambling market rather than insurance. So, any solutions to that?
No, but I think you're raising a valid point that the traditional way we have been trying to sell insurance does not work. So when talking about embedding it, so in the past we have talked about embedding it into existing homeowners policy, whatever, but that's just bundling together the same problem. But we need to think about embedding it into totally different types of services and solutions that we are looking for to buy, and to get that automatically with it, potentially.
I think we have to rethink how people think of insurance and the value it brings. I was very struck by a senior gentleman who retired, and in his parting speech, he recounted a story of a family in Singapore who went on holiday in the Himalayas. They spent $25 on a travel PA policy. The father had a stroke out in the Himalayas. He was flown back to Singapore, all paid for by the insurance policy, and he recovered and the family was whole. We are lousy in the insurance industry about explaining that type of story. For $25, that family was held together. He would have died on the slopes. And it's that type of thinking that we have to change, because unfortunately, insurance is a product that has to be sold, and it's not an instant gratification product. You go to the bank, you get a loan. The fact you've been missold a whole variety of things around it, you don't care, because you've got that loan, you bought your car, your house, you know, whatever you're going to do with it. It's not that. Insurance is at the heart of it. We don't explain that value, and I think that's what we have to try and do a lot better. There was a very, very nice example in Australia following the floods in Brisbane in 2011. There was a small community outside Brisbane that had been repeatedly flooded, and the local authority had announced that they were going to build a levee to protect the town, but they hadn't done it. And the leading insurance company in Queensland gave up and said, look, this is flooding the whole time. You know, we're not going to issue any new policies. They tripled the rates. The levee was built 2 years later. That insurance company went back to every one of their insurance policyholders who stuck with them, gave them a rebate on all the increased premiums that they paid, and started writing new policies, because a $12 million investment by the local council to build a relatively modest levee was paid off. Now, that type of story, nobody talks about.
So we need to close and move to the next panel, but there is time later at the cafe. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Matthew Eagle from Guy Carpenter. I run the analytics team for the EMEA region, and I think by now you worked out, unlike the two previous panel chairs, I'm not one of the authors, but I was one of the lucky ones to get an early pre-read in preparation for today, and we're very happy to be one of the supporters of this terrific bit of research. And our third topic is on this question of the evolving remit or mission creep, which we're going to look at. It's covered in the report in a one called talk about this new term, protection gap entities or stopgap entities, which you'll get a chance to look at. So to help us discuss the topic, we have three people on the panel with significant track record and experience in this area. I'll try and be brief. I've noticed we're running beyond time. Firstly, we have Andy Board, who is the Chief Executive of Flood Re. As you know, the joint initiative set up between industry and government to promote the availability of affordable home insurance to those that live at the greatest risk of flood in the UK. Andy spent half his career in the telecoms industry in senior product and customer-facing, customer service roles, moved in financial services, and prior to joining Flood Re was the CEO at Capita Insurance Services, which provided a lot of outsourced, range of outsourced services to the London market and other clients. Sitting next to Andy is Julian Noisy, who is the Chief Executive, and you've already been introduced, of Pool Re, the pool that was, as Paul has highlighted, established back in 1993 in response to the market failure after the withdrawal of some of the reinsurance cover. The pool now protects, I believe, over about 2 trillion of exposure in commercial property. Julian joined the pool in 2013, where the remit and has presided over kind of repositioning the organization and has made a number of a series of advancements in that area, and I won't try and list them all. For those who don't know, Julian is a qualified lawyer, has practiced across Europe before he embarked in Korean insurance, and had a number of CEO roles at CNA, Argo, and most recently ProSite. Julian has many advisory roles, and one to mention, he was awarded Freedom of the City of London in 2010, and is now also a visiting professor at the University of Cranfield, with whom Pool Re do a lot of joint research. And finally, not one of the PG CEOs, but Alex Milnes joined us. Alex is head of insurance, capital markets and trade at the Department for International Trade. Joined in 2014 to lead on joint industry and government initiatives to tackle market barriers. Is currently responsible for driving insurance initiatives globally. And to quote from what Alex sent me kindly ahead of this, he's looking a lot into the technology world, so facilitating government and industry dialogues on city resiliency and promoting UK insurtech firms and using technology to quantify and tackle new and emerging risks. Alex does come from the insurance sector beforehand, was previously at the Lloyd's of London, focusing on market access and expanding the Lloyd's global footprint. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andy, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Paula. Good evening, everyone. I guess first observation, looking at the previous panel in particular, was it was somewhat more of a binary question, voluntary or mandatory. I think the discussion we're looking at in terms of evolving remit or scope creep is more of a continuum, and certainly as someone that has had the opportunity to read the research in advance, it's pre-positioned as somewhat of a loaded question as well in terms of PGEs, as we've labelled them, should absolutely evolve to meet the evolving threat or the evolving peril. So I want to give a few thoughts as someone in a relatively new PGE. We're only 2 years old at Flood.Re, and talk about it from a structural context. So Flood.Re, as you rightly summarised, exists to promote the availability of affordable flood insurance to those that live at the highest risk of flooding within the UK. And it's being very successful at that in the first 2 years. However, we also have a requirement, an obligation built into our mandate to evolve, or as we describe it, transition to an environment where risk-reflective pricing can take place within 25 years. So that date point is 2039. So actually, not only is it cited as a good idea as per the research, we've actually got a requirement to evolve or transition over that timescale, but perhaps with a particular context, which is not so much about Flood.Re evolving as a PGE, but about creating the context in which the market can evolve. It won't be Flood.Re that creates excuse me, an environment that can price each risk on a risk-reflective basis. It will be a market that's evolved either through the development of resilience at local, community or state level, or through better modelling, or through other activities that over time will significantly reduce the number of households that are left without the ability to gain competitive insurance. So what we've been looking at is, if this was an easy problem, it clearly would have been addressed over previous years. We wouldn't have had the somewhat dysfunctional statement of principles that existed before Flood.Re came into existence. So in some ways, we are the lucky recipients almost of, here's a mandate to deliver the operational solution, and here's the really tricky problem that no one else could solve either. Please do it before you do yourself out of a job in 25 years. So the way we've approached that is to develop a set of principles. So we know what some of the activity is that needs to take place. We know that includes promoting resilience, promoting better risk awareness. So we've developed 5 fairly straightforward but fundamental principles to establish whether or not we will promote activity in this space. So this is almost our evolution or our transition charter. The first is additionality. So we will only be involved in activity where we are filling a gap that doesn't exist anywhere else. We won't be duplicating other agencies' work. The second is leveraging significant expertise. We've got the luxury, unlike most of the other panelists, of being a monoline reinsurer. We're only looking at one peril. Therefore, the level of insight that we build up, both at a data level but also at a personal expertise level, is significant. So it's leveraging that expertise. The third is perhaps the obvious one, which is impact. We will only work in areas where we can have impact which is proportionate to the effort that's going in. The fourth one is about sustainability, which goes hand in hand with the requirement to transition, because we shouldn't be putting in place stopgap measures that look good in the short term. They've actually got to live through the term and have got to come to fruition within a predefined timescale. And finally, partnership. As Paula identified within the research, PGEs are unlikely to do this in isolation. So working with partners, Flood.Re is in essence a partnership formed PGE between the industry and governments. It's working with government agencies, but also working directly with consumers and representative groups. So in summary, it's not easy to ensure that it's evolving remit rather than scope creep, but being pretty rigorous about that and taking your stakeholders with you on that journey can keep it in the former.
Thanks, Andy. I'll just make 2 or 3 points, if I may. First of all, I think one of the things that I often say is that my role is actually to wind Pool Re up and to put it out of business. As I have been in this job now for 4 years, I've begun to realize just how difficult that actually is to do. We could wind it up tomorrow and return the risk to the market. The problem is it wouldn't be sustainable, because after an event, what you would find is that the capacity would dry up. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is how do you actually do that? Biggest problem that we have is that the market, as Paula I think highlighted in the report, has become apathetic. It's forgotten how to assess and price this risk, because for 25 years it's relied on us. And therefore weaning the market off of our reliance on us is actually much harder. The other problem, of course, is that the risk has evolved. So 25 years ago, you had a supply side issue. Today, arguably, you have a demand side issue. So you've actually got lack of demand. People actually don't buy terrorism insurance for many of the reasons that you heard on the previous panel. One of the things that we've tried to do to address that is to create an ecosystem. So as part of our journey towards pushing risk back to the market, one of the things that we've tried to do is to actually raise awareness of what the risk is. So we actually invested in terrorism risk analysis so that we could actually provide information to businesses as to what their risk was, so that they could then take the decision to buy. And talking about the distribution issue, one of the things that we believe is not necessarily a binary choice between voluntary and mandatory, but actually that you could make it mandatory to offer the cover. That way the moral hazard goes away, because if the insured chooses not to take it up, after the event, you can say, well, here was your opportunity to buy the product. The product covered all the risks that you would expect a terrorism product to cover. It was affordably priced. You chose not to buy it, and therefore you're on your own. The other thing about an ecosystem is it allows you to invest in all of the things that, because we have a significant market share, we're able to provide the market with. So we can invest in modeling, we can invest in risk analysis, we can try and do work on pricing, we can try and do work on assessing frequency and severity, we can partner with academia to do some of that research, and then we can provide that information to a market, can then decide how much of that risk it wants to take, and how much of it wants to retain itself, or how much of it wants to reinsure. And so a lot of the things that we've been doing to normalize the market is to actually get the market back involved, weaning it off of reliance of us. And we've done that by increasing the deductibles for the insurers so that the insurance market get back involved. And we've then done that by getting the reinsurance globally back involved in this risk for the first time in 25 years. The other thing that we believe is that the pre-funded model, the ability to have actually built up a fund of money to pay for future losses, is something that we should actually now utilize perhaps more proactively, and part of that is investing in risk mitigation. So one of the things that we've tried to do is to identify, working with government, what are the behavioral changes that we can influence. So by reducing policy premiums, we can actually influence behavioral change. By training risk engineers and insurance companies, we can get them to influence change by saying to their customers, if you implement these 3 or 4 things, then your premium will reduce. And so investment in risk mitigation becomes something that actually is done in a consistent way, partnered with government who actually know what the change that they want to influence is, and partnering with academia who've actually done the research to actually know what those behavioral changes should be. So I think if you're answering the question, I think in terms of evolution or mission creep, I don't think anybody's going to advocate mission creep, but certainly evolution, I think you have to do. And I think just to close, if you look at the British government in the last 2 years has acted twice, once to future-proof Pool Re in terms of cyber, and the other one to respond to a threat that has emerged in the last few years because of the changing nature of the threat, which is non-damage business interruption. But you can see white space everywhere. And you can see it in personal accident policies, which still exclude terrorism. You can see it in the discussion that's going on in the industry around motor. You can see it in the fact that Northern Ireland is still a compensation scheme as opposed to an insurance scheme, which means that the government is still carrying risk on its balance sheet that perhaps it doesn't need to because it could transfer it to the insurance market. And you can see it in victim compensation and the differences in that, which is being highlighted at the moment. So a lot of white space, and I think actually properly run protection gap entities can close those gaps, but do so in a way that the market participates in that risk.
Thank you. You're probably wondering why is a second person from the government here to speak to you today. I am obviously work for the Department of National Trade. We have got involved very closely with kind of city risk and resilience agenda because I think many governments we're working with around the world, and when we're trying to work with the London market and local insurance industry in the UK to get market access or help better advertise products, it's really the theme of kind of resilience and societal risk that a lot of local public sector officials are very interested in addressing. Interestingly, earlier I heard obviously about developed markets having a massive protection gap. No one's yet mentioned the US, obviously, which I don't need to tell this room that last year was such a damaging and actually poignant moment for the insurance industry in the US. And the UK industry is a big part of managing and mitigating some of that as well. So because of that, and partly because of that and some of the other stuff we've been doing kind of city resilience roadshows, where we've actually been taking insurers and brokers, risk modelers, UK public sector entities, not PGEs, but people like the Environment Agency, to basically have holistic conversations with cities about their risk. I think, interestingly, the other week, Lloyd's released their City Risk Index report and actually highlighted that man-made risks are, economically at the moment more damaging than the physical risks. So in terms of taking a holistic view across the piece, that's really where I think that the industry can interact with government on this. I'm not going to recommend a new PGE, or my colleagues from the Treasury might tackle me off the stage, but I really see this intersection between public and private in terms of finding solutions for societal problems of risk as a direction which the insurance industry wants to take further. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there.
Thanks to the three panelists. I think it was very timely. You've all been very quick, but on point in terms of looking at two organizations and how you've both had to look at the evolving remit. And I guess one of them is around looking at the risk mitigation. The other one is about coverage. And I remember speaking to this topic with a colleague and said, effectively we need to get real. If we don't evolve the remit to meet some of these new challenges you mentioned, cyber, we become increasingly irrelevant as a sector or as an industry. And Alex obviously also focusing on government initiatives to look at a much more holistic view of this risk and the resiliency. So I think we've got a few minutes to open for one or two questions. Got two early hands up. We'll have a new one.
John Gaskell and Willis Towers Watson. There are some expressions, what gets measured gets managed, and also models make markets. I wonder to what extent you feel the role of risk quantification and risk modelling is important for these PGEs. And also, I suppose, this notion of PGEs, could they present possibly a pre-competitive space for the insurance industry to provide industry-wide analytics and research, for example?
Anyone want to volunteer?
I'll have a go. I recognise the RMS tagline there. I think the answer is absolutely. I think perhaps I mentioned academia, I mentioned government, and perhaps modelling agencies as the fourth leg of the stool in a sense, or fourth leg of the chair, because the problem with say terrorism is 25 years ago there was no terrorism model. Today we're entering into blast modelling. You start to look at cyber terrorism models, but actually what we should be doing is collaborating much more closely with the likes of the modelling agencies, and certainly we have begun to do that. Just because it's difficult to model something from a frequency perspective shouldn't mean that we don't try, but perhaps the flood guys might have a better handle on it.
I think the simple answer is yes. We should be doing more with modelling, both in terms of using that directly to ensure that the risk is better understood and therefore risks are ceded at the appropriate price in the right place, but also to use it to help advance, so particularly from a flood re perspective, to advance consumer understanding of risk as well, so to make that information more available, more accessible and more relevant and delivered by channels that actually mean something to the end consumers. We know at the moment that there's extremely low correlation between the absolute level of risk that people live at and the level of risk that they perceive they're at. If they've been flooded, they genuinely believe it can't happen again, and if they haven't been flooded, they don't think it can ever happen to them. That's what we get told. And therefore using numbers, or perhaps something slightly sexier, more creative than pure numbers, has got to help us in that space, yeah.
Ravim Ismail, Fractal Industries again. Julian, you've mentioned an example of encouraging the private market by getting the reinsurance market involved again. And one of the unique things which Andy's mentioned has been the long-term horizon which PGEs can have. So, thinking on the 20, 25-year timescale, thinking of genuinely new types of risk transfer that can occur within that time. Are there any other examples, not at the risk transfer at the back, but the risk transference at the front, of where rather than evolving and changing and expanding, of contraction, i.e., other examples of being successful in your mission, and of course, as a representative of IFTRIP, whether that's happened in any other market as well for a PGE.
How much should they pay you to ask that question, the insurers? Well, the answer to that question is there are two approaches, and we've taken one, which is to get the insurance market more involved through the retentions and the reinsurance market out the back. The alternative would be, as you say, to take the pieces of the risk. I mean, let's be honest, non-damage business interruption is a risk the market could insure. For whatever reason, it's chosen not to, whether that's because it can't figure out how to price it, or it can't model it, or it can't change its systems. Whatever the reason, it's chosen not to. The question, therefore, is can we give them back the elements of the risk that they should be able to write, non-damage, small businesses, regional locations which are less at risk than perhaps central London, but to do so in a sustainable way, and also to prevent the cherry picking and the adverse selection against the government, because what will end up happening, as you know, is the government will end up with all of the catastrophic risk and very little of the premium. So you end up with a subsidised market as opposed to a functioning market, and I think that's the challenge. But we are thinking about how to do it, but it's not easy.
Anyone else want to add anything?
I just want to go slightly back to the modelling point. I think no, that's fine. That's fine. So I mean, obviously the mantra models make markets. What we've found is actually a lot of the way that cities are looking at their risk profile, and whether it's flood maps or there's other kind of versions, they don't always speak to the models that the insurance industry uses, and this is actually a massively key kind of sticking point, because if everyone could speak the same language of resilience, forgive the pun, then surely we'd have a better shared understanding, and then we'd be able to have better shared solutions to that.
We have time for one more, or do you want to open it up? Thanks very much to the three panelists.